Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're watching this webinar from. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kate Chalker and I'm a solicitor based in our Sydney office. Today, also joining me will be Paul McEnroth, who is a principal based in our Brisbane office. And today, Paul will be exploring a couple of the different rollover opportunities which exist within the tax legislation to either enable someone to restructure their business or to restructure a CGT asset. Paul today will also be looking at some of the recent developments in relation to Queensland transfer duty, which were brought in late 2020 and recently amended. Today, there are two different files for you to download, and you can do that by simply clicking on the Files tab on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can download from there the PowerPoint slides from today, and then the other document is a copy of the Queensland public ruling on that transfer duty, which Paul will be talking about towards the end of the webinar. If you have any questions which come to mind throughout the presentation, you're more than welcome to submit those. All you have to do is click on the chat function, again on the right-hand side of the screen, and feel free to type those in at any time throughout the webinar. I'll be monitoring those questions and I'll be happy to interrupt Paul at an appropriate time for him to answer those questions for you. Just letting you know that today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our website at a later time. And also there will be a feedback email which will come out later today. So we'll be grateful if you could take some time to complete that survey, and as always, recommend any topics which you might be interested in hearing about because we always welcome those suggestions. So without any further ado, I think I will hand over to Paul to get started with the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And good morning or afternoon to everyone. And thanks for joining me this week. It's been a little while since I've presented. Adrian's done the brunt of the webinars recently, I think mainly because he was stuck in his house at home in Sydney and had some extra time to, work himself up to give these webinars. He's done a great job, and hopefully I'll do the same today. So yeah, we're going to talk about some rollover opportunities. We're going to talk about two rollovers in particular today. I had extended it to a few more, but the slides just kept getting bigger and bigger. So I've narrowed it down to two rollovers that we're going to talk about today, mainly because they're two I've recently used for clients in looking to restructure some businesses, but also some of the, feedback in recent weeks or questions we've had following webinars. Some of the topics were, some of those questions were about these rollovers and their utility for a particular circumstance. So thought it would be relevant and timely for you. At the back end of the paper, we're going to talk about some recent changes in Queensland. I know we've got a lot of Queensland people on here today. Stamp duty has always been one of the main prohibiting factors to using rollovers. Certainly the subdivision 122A. Not so much that the changes won't affect the 124N rollover that we'll talk about, but there are some opportunities now that the OSR are allowing taxpayers to have. The ability to move to a company structure without a duty payable in those circumstances. Now, they are limited circumstances, so it won't be for everyone, but it's welcome relief. So we'll talk a little bit about that. As Kate said, we have put both the slideshow and also that administrative ruling in the file sharing section, so feel free to download those. So we always like to have case studies, and your feedback to us is that you enjoy the case studies. The case studies I've used today, you believe it or not, it's actually quite difficult to come up with case studies without using real life clients that you know about, and these Two case studies we're going to talk about are real life clients. And if there's a particular LRC member in Sydney sitting on today, he may recognise this first client, where the circumstances have changed a little, obviously, for the purpose of the case study, but in broad terms, this is what we were going to do for a client until this deal fell over, but this was the plan. So Bottles R Us operates a pharmaceutical bottling company in Sydney. Partly use Sydney because there's no stamp duty, so we don't need to talk about that. But this client was actually in Sydney. So their business had operated for many years through a discretionary trust. The controller of that trust had some discussions about bringing in a key employee, and that key employee was going to take a small stake in the company, or in the business. Obviously, we can't sell a 1% interest in a 10% interest in a discretionary trust unless we're going to go into partnership together. So we might sell a 10% stake in the business and enter a partnership. Now, the client in this circumstance doesn't want to operate in a partnership, and they are interested in moving to a corporate structure to allow the entry of that extra person. So in this circumstance, we'd recommend, I guess, a two-step process. The first being utilising a rollover under subdivision 122A of the 1997 Tax Act. Now, this applies to trustees or individuals, and we're going to go through, I guess, what the conditions of that rollover look like. But to put it in really short terms, if you're transferring the business from a discretionary trust or an individual sole trader to a brand new company that's been established for this purpose, and the trustee or the individual is the sole shareholder at the end of that rollover process, it will be very simple to meet all of the requirements. Now, there are quite a number of requirements, but in short, that process is quite simple. If you've got a brand new company, you might issue one share initially and then issue perhaps 1 million shares on the rollover. It will be fairly simple to meet these requirements. So as much as there are a lot of requirements, it will be easy to meet those. So the first is there must be a disposal in this circumstance of all the assets of the business to a wholly owned company. Now, this rollover does apply to a single CGT asset, and that's one of our examples later. But in this circumstance, we're disposing of all the assets of the business to a wholly owned company. The consideration for that disposal can only be shares in the company or shares in the assumption of liability. Now, obviously, that takes into account we're transferring a business which probably has liabilities, and our company is going to assume those liabilities when it takes over the business. The trust in this circumstance must own all of the shares after the transfer. Now, the Commissioner has a ruling that says you don't even need to issue new shares. So you might be able to start the company with 1 share or 100 shares and merely transfer the business in that circumstance, and you still would meet this requirement, provided that obviously the trust in this circumstance is the sole shareholder after the transfer of the business. The shares must be non-redeemable shares, so they have to be ordinary class. We would use ordinary class shares or a similar class. The market value of the assets that you transfer must be substantially the same as the market value of the shares. And in a company where you have a nominal asset base, which is effectively, for example, the $1 you've contributed for the shares, well, that is going to be met, because the market value of the business assets that are transferred are going to be roughly equivalent to the market value of your shares. And the trust that's transferring must be a resident trust. This rollover doesn't apply to a range of assets, being collectibles, personal use assets, precluded assets. Now, precluded assets includes depreciating assets and trading stock. And obviously we are transferring potentially some of those assets. However, there are other sections within the Tax Act, for example, in Division 40 in relation to depreciating assets, which say effectively, if you meet all the requirements of subdivision 122A, then you get a rollover relief for the depreciating assets. So that's how it works, albeit that it doesn't technically apply to precluded assets. It will if you're transferring all the assets of the business. What that part is designed to stop is using 122A in order to just transfer depreciating assets, for example. And the company can't be exempt from income tax. So, as I said, in most circumstances where we use a brand new company that we've ordered, immediately prior to doing the rollover, it has ordinary class shares issued to the trustee. In those circumstances, it will be easy to meet these requirements. Now, the consequences of this rollover for the trustee, obviously it is an election, so you elect to apply the rollover in subdivision 122A. And if you do, any capital gain or loss made from the trigger event, being that the transfer, is disregarded. That obviously is the basis of all rollovers. So, the way a rollover works is that we disregard the capital gain on this CGT event, and we effectively carry forward our cost base in our new asset. So with this rollover, there's a number of different ways we can carry forward that cost base. So if we've got all pre-CGT assets, in this circumstance as a business, probably very unlikely. But if this rollover were applied to just one CGT asset, and that asset was a pre-CGT asset, then that asset the shares, in the company going forward would also be pre-CGT shares. Where all of the assets are post-CGT assets, the first element of each share's cost base is, and it's a little bit of a formula. Okay, so each element is the sum of the market values of precluded assets and the cost base of the other assets divided by the number of shares. So it is a mathematical formula to get to the answer of what our cost base is for those assets or the shares that are issued. But we simply just go through that process to determine what our cost base for our shares is. Where there's a mixture of pre and post CGT assets, we'll need to determine what the mix in terms of their values are. And again, there's another formula. So the next slide probably is a better way to look at it. So what we look at first is the total market value of all pre-CGT assets that are not precluded assets. So again, that trading stock, depreciating assets, highly unlikely that you've got trading stock that's pre-CGT, less any liabilities the company undertakes. Now we take that number and divide it by the total market value of all the assets that are transferred, less the liabilities that are assumed. So if we take our example, we're going to say that there's no liabilities assumed. That's just for simple mathematics here. But our pre-CGT asset is a goodwill. We started this business, many years ago before CGT was a thing, and our market value today is $1 million. We've got obviously plant and equipment and trading stock, and they've got a cost and a market value there. So when we look at those figures and apply it to that formula, the first is the total market value of pre-CGT assets that are not precluded assets minus liabilities. So that's our figure of $1 million, which was our market value of the goodwill. And we divide that number by the total market value of all assets less liabilities, which is the whole amount of $1.6 million. and we divide that number by 100, we would get 62.5%. We'd round that number down to 62. So in that circumstance, we know that 62% of our shares that are issued are pre-CGT shares. So, in that way, we're not losing the benefit of having a pre-CGT asset. The consequences for the company: if the trustee had acquired the assets pre-CGT, the acquiring company is taken to have acquired those assets in the same way as pre-CGT assets. And again, if the company acquires a post-CGT asset, the company is taken to have acquired that asset as a post-CGT asset, and the company takes on the cost base of those CGT assets going forward. So in our circumstance where we're looking to bring in a key employee at a 10% stake in the business, the business is in a discretionary trust, the Bottles R Us trust. We would look to transfer all of the assets of the business to Bottling Co, and Bottling Co would issue 62% of pre-CGT shares and 38% of post-CGT shares. The reason we've put percentages there is we would ordinarily look at issuing one share for every dollar of value. The reason we do that is that when you're looking at that market value equation, so the market value of the business assets that are transferred must be substantially the same is the language, substantially the same as the market value of the issued shares. If we started Bottling Co with 100 shares at $1 a share, if we only issued 100 shares, for example, well, the market value of the shares that are issued is not substantially the same as the value of those assets. So we would ordinarily have a nominal amount of shares on issue when the company begins, and then issue a significantly higher portion of shares just to, work through that, the mechanics of making sure that the issued shares are substantially the same market value. So then obviously our second step would be looking at selling 10% stake to our new owner. As we said before, we've got 52% of pre-CGT shares, 38% post. Now, to be up to the client which shares they wanted to transfer. Obviously, if there's post-CGT shares, there'll be some tax potentially payable, but maybe not, depending on what concessions might be available. Or we might transfer pre-CGT shares. That'd be a question you'd go through with the client as to which shares they want to transfer, noting that, well, if this business, explodes in value in the future years, it might be more beneficial to have, more pre-CGT shares. So in terms of other, applications of this rollover, this was a question we had in one of our feedback surveys a couple of sessions ago, was in relation to, well, can we use a 122A rollover to transfer cryptocurrency? The short answer is yes, we can, because cryptocurrency is a CGT asset, and this rollover would apply. If we're establishing a new company in which the individual who owns the cryptocurrency transfers those assets to the company in exchange for an issue of shares, provided we meet those requirements, which, as I said, should be simple, that this rollover would allow for that to occur. And another use for this rollover is where we're looking at it for asset protection, where we might have significant retained earnings in a company, and as we know, when they reduced the corporate rate for small business tax or small business corporate entities, Along with that came some quirks in that if, in our scenario, Bike Parts Store Proprietary Limited paid a dividend to Bob's Trust, when Bob's Trust, as an asset protection device, paid that dividend through to another reserve company because they didn't want to take the full dividend to individuals, for example, Bike Parts Store Proprietary Limited, as a base rate entity, would be taxable this year at 25%, and that would be the maximum frankable amount. Once that company dividend goes through Bob's Trust and on to a reserve company or a corporate beneficiary, the corporate beneficiary is very likely going to be taxed at 30%. So in effect, we've got a 5% tax on that dividend. So that was one of the probably an intended consequence, but one of those unfortunate consequences of the changes in the corporate tax rate. Now, we might look at other ways of moving that dividend out of Bike Parts Store so that we don't have that 5% top-up rate. If we interpose a head company between the shareholders and Bike Parts Store using a 122A rollover, we can pay a dividend from Bike Parts Store down to Headco. And because that dividend will be what's called a non-portfolio dividend, which is effective, or essentially it's a dividend from one company to another company, where the second company has a 10% or greater voting rights in the first company. So in this case, it's going to own all the shares in Bike Parts, so that will be satisfied. That dividend will be a non-portfolio dividend, which is base rate passive entity income. So all these great acronyms. So in this circumstance, we can pay a dividend between those two companies and move those retained earnings out of Headco. Now, that doesn't completely inoculate the entity from risk, because obviously there are some provisions in the Corporations Act that say where a head company allows effectively a subsidiary to trade whilst insolvent, then the head company can be liable for the debts. Now, that circumstance, I would suggest, is a lower risk than leaving, a substantially lower risk than leaving the dividend the retained earnings in our operating company. And certainly it's a risk that can be managed. So that's certainly an example we might look to use. One of the other options for corporate groups is using this structure, but in I guess creating other businesses within this structure. Headco might create another subsidiary and either lend money to that subsidiary that has come from Bike Parts Store and lend it to the new subsidiary to operate a different arm of the business or a different business altogether, or it might subscribe for shares. That's obviously the other alternative way of capitalising that new subsidiary. So from here, we could develop a corporate group, so to speak, and possibly, if it were right at the time, look at consolidation at some point down the road if that were, I guess, a sensible option for the clients. So you can see that subdivision 122A gives us a lot of versatility. One of the issues for particularly Queensland and WA is that stamp duty is still a big question that we have to answer in these scenarios. But as I said, there has been some movement in Queensland. Hopefully there'll be a lot more movement than we've seen in Queensland, and hopefully some in WA in the future. So coming to case study 2, we're going to look at a rollover involving unit trusts. So in this trust, we've got the Courier Drivers Unit Trust, and it operates a courier business. Because of the significantly higher trade through COVID-19, the unit trust has significantly higher profits. And as a result of that, it's become a takeover target for larger operators. Now, being a unit trust is always, like most trusts, a cash flow drain through the requirements of cash flowing distributions to beneficiaries and the need to avoid, I guess, Division 7A commitments that need to be put in place if we're distributing that income to corporate beneficiaries. And the owners are looking effectively to move to a company structure. So looking at a Division 124N rollover, the general conditions of this are that all of the CGT assets of the trust, or it can be multiple trusts, must be disposed of to the company during the trust restructuring period. Effectively, that trust restructuring period is a period of 6 months starting from the date of the first transfer. Obviously, bearing in mind that not all things transfer immediately. Title, takes time and things like that. So they allow a trust restructuring period of 6 months. The trust can retain some assets for the payment of debts, and that's probably, going to be cash in most circumstances. The second requirement is that CGT event E4 must be capable of applying to all of the interests in the trust. Effectively, what that means is that it can't be a hybrid trust. So it has to be a unit trust where there's no discretionary powers of distribution. CGT event E4 applies where a unit trust might distribute a capital-free amount, and in some circumstances, that will, in those circumstances, it will reduce the cost base of the units. In the unit trust. So provided we've got no hybrid or discretionary powers, we'll be able to meet that requirement. Again, that trust restructuring period, so all of the CGT assets have to be disposed of during that period. Just after the restructuring period, the shareholders must own shares in the company in the same proportion. So the unit holders in our unit trust effectively move across and become shareholders in the new company, and they must hold their shares in the same capacity and in the same proportions that they held in the unit trust. So if there's 2 unit holders with a 60-40 split, they must become shareholders in the company, again in a 60-40 split. Now, there is a provision which allows you to disregard a nominal amount of shares with a low share value, provided they're less than 5. So in this circumstance, if there was a company that had less than 5 shares issued to myself and 2 trusts were the unit holders in the unit trust, if the company issued shares to those 2 trusts, the fact that I had shares less than 5 would be disregarded in those circumstances. Not sure that is all that relevant in most circumstances. Most companies that are set up for the purpose of this would be set up with Trust A and Trust B owning the initial shares in the company, but it is there if needed. And in this scenario, both the company and the unit trust must jointly apply the rollover. So in this circumstance, the unit trust says, yes, I'm going to roll over these assets to you. My unit holders are going to get shares in you, the company, and the company and the trust must together apply rollover relief. The rollover is not available for a CGT asset that is trading stock of the trust, or if the asset becomes trading stock. So oftentimes, a lot of the I guess commentary on that is dealing with assets that are held perhaps as CGT asset, and then when they're transferred across, become immediately after that trading stock. They are dealt with in other sections of the Tax Act. So the consequences of this rollover: the unit trust can disregard any capital gain or loss on the disposal of those CGT assets to the company, under this trust restructure. The cost base and reduced cost base of the CGT assets that are transferred become the first element of the cost base of that asset for the company. So effectively, those cost bases move across with the trust assets. Again, if the original asset or one of them is a pre-CGT asset, then the company will be treated as if it acquired a pre-CGT asset. One of the requirements of this is that within 6 months of the trust restructuring period, the unit trust itself must be wound up. So it is a reorganisation of the affairs of the business, but it is acknowledging that this trust is no longer required and we're going to bring it to an end. Obviously, when that trust is wound up, CGT event C2 happens for the unit holders, and C2 is a cancellation of units. In that circumstance, ordinarily, a CGT event would occur. There would probably be a capital loss because there is no real return to the unit holders. But in those circumstances, the beneficiary chooses the rollover in respect of their unit, and their capital gain or loss made from the interest in the trust being replaced by shares is disregarded. So the cost base for their units then gets carried across and is shared evenly across however many shares they receive in that company. So if the cost base of my units was $1,000 and I got issued 1,000 shares in the new company, then my cost base will be $1 per share. Again, for pre-CGT units, the shares received in exchange are also taken to be pre-CGT shares. So looking at it on the screen, this is how we would, I guess this is how it works. We transfer all of the assets of the business to a new company. Bill's Trust and Bob's Trust own 60 and a 60-40 split in the unit trust. They are issued with shares in the new company in those same proportions. Our unit trust gets wound up within that 6-month period after the trust restructuring period, and on that wind up, the CGT event C2 is disregarded, and the cost base of our units gets transferred across to the cost base of our shares. Okay, so that is, I guess, the end of the 124N rollover. Probably just in summary, what it allows us to do is to transfer all of the assets of a unit trust to a company where the unit holders become the shareholders in that company. All of the assets of the company will carry across their cost base, and that includes the time of acquisition and whether it's a pre-CGT or post-CGT asset. And also our unit holders will become shareholders in the company, and the CGT event that occurs for them is disregarded. And then going forward, they, I guess, carry across their cost base from their units. Now, see on the next slide, I uploaded the wrong paper, and this one had a further case study, which I'm happy to go through because we have still got a bit of time, and I'll try to make this one quick. So this case study is about Division 615. This is where we're looking to do a similar rollover to the 122A rollover, where we're that asset protection strategy I was looking at. But in this circumstance, there's more than one shareholder in our company. So what we're doing, we have an operating company, in this case, Lots of Money Proprietary Limited, and it operates a successful mortgage broking firm. They're looking at diversifying into different businesses, but don't want to do it in the same entity. And they're looking to also form a corporate group structure because they're looking forward and can see the day that they want to sell the whole enterprise to a multinational firm. Okay. Obviously, I only missed one slide because I've cut out the rest. My apologies for that. I'll go through it in any event without having any slides. I'm happy to release the slides to anyone who would like them. What that rollover requires is, and I'll go back one slide. What that rollover requires is all of the shareholders, and there must be more than one, so there must be two or more. Those shareholders enter into an arrangement with another company. In this case, it would be a head company. And the arrangement is that the head company acquires their shares in the operating company in exchange for shares in the head company. So again, it's that interposition of a head company between the operating company and the original shareholders. Now, after the transfer has happened, the head company must own all of the shares in the operating company, and they must, the shares that are issued to the original shareholders, again, must be issued in the same proportions that the original shareholders owned in the operating company and to the same entities in the same capacity. So again, there's lots of requirements really designed to stop anyone trying to, transfer shares to someone else and house it under this term of a rollover. So provided those requirements are all met, what the end structure looks like is we have our operating company, which is then owned wholly by a head company, which is owned by multiple shareholders. In this scenario, we had 3 shareholders. The difference between this and a 122A is that under 122A, each of those individual shareholders would have an interposed entity between them and the operating company. So you have an operating company, 3, in effect, head companies, and then the shareholder of that head company would be each individual trust. That's not what we want in this scenario. What we want is the ability to pay a dividend from our operating company to our head company to move out that, those retained earnings, and then invest those monies into other subsidiaries to establish our financial planning business or establish our stockbroking or other entity. In that way, going forward, the individual business units would be able to be sold off either in totality. So you'd sell the head company, for example, or you might sell off individual companies. So if you wanted to just sell the mortgage broking firm, you could sell the shares in that mortgage broking firm. When you're dealing with larger businesses buying businesses, you'll find that they are they're more open to buying company shares than perhaps a small business operator is. That is one of the questions we get often when we're looking at, doing these restructures as well. Aren't they going to want to buy the business assets? Our very recent experience acting on a number of significant deals is that the multinationals are more than happy to buy companies rather than the business assets. It's actually simpler for them if they come in and buy the shares, and provided they do their due diligence and the like. So as I said, I had taken this case study out, but I missed one slide. If you'd like to know a bit more about that one, please let me know, put it in the feedback, and I'll send you the slides for that. So turning to the recent Queensland stamp duty changes, now, many of the rollovers in this paper would ordinarily be subject to duty, particularly in Queensland. In New South Wales and Victoria, there won't be duty on these types of transactions. There can be some little snags where you might be transferring For example, in New South Wales, there's a little trick if you're transferring a lease that has chattels that are included in the lease. There's some stamp duty implications there, but realistically, these can be done primarily without any duty in those states. However, in Queensland, ordinarily duty would apply, certainly in WA. Now, the Commissioner of Stamp Duty in Queensland came out with a public ruling. You've got it available for download. And in that ruling, they've allowed some administrative exceptions to the law. Now, these are not the law, but the Commissioner says that he will abide by his administrative arrangement. Now, there are 4 circumstances where the Commissioner says he won't impose duty, or 4 different types of transfers. If a number of requirements are met, no duty. So if we have a sole trader or partnership, if we transfer the assets of the business to a company owned by that sole trader or the partners in the partnership, or a discretionary trust is transferring the assets of the small business to a company owned by either the default beneficiaries in the trust or the trustee of the trust. In those circumstances, principally, those are the transfer types that the Commissioner will allow, subject to a couple of conditions. Now, the 4th one being a discretionary trust transferring to a company owned by the trustee of the trust, obviously in that capacity, effectively mirrors subdivision 122A that we talked about. Now, the sole trader at the top, again, mirrors subdivision 122A. The second one being the partnership mirrors subdivision 122B, which we haven't talked about, but effectively it is a partnership transferring the assets of the partnership to a company owned by the partners in their respective proportion. So the third one on that list, transfer to a company owned by default beneficiaries, was kind of the outlier when this ruling came out last year, because there is no corresponding rollover relief. So it kind of made, I guess, that part of it a little bit, difficult to comprehend as to why that was the path they chose. Anyway, this year, about 2 months ago, they brought out the 4th option, which again mirrors 122A. So the conditions. Now, it is quite narrow, the circumstances where you'll be allowed to use this. So the entity must be a small business entity, which means that they directly hold small business property and carry on a business that is conducted in Queensland, and it consists wholly or partly of supplying land, money, credit, or goods to Queensland customers, and has an annual turnover of not more than $5 million. So that, again, that's just another dollar figure we've got to keep in our head for what is a small business entity in the tax world. But again, that is quite limited, particularly given some of the changes that have happened recently. The small business property must be property that is actively used in the business to carry on the businesses or the business of the small business entity. So again, it's not talking about passive assets that are owned in a discretionary trust. It's got to be assets owned in the business. And albeit that it's in far different language, it's kind of similar to the active asset tests in the Income Tax Act. The business value, or the transfer value, for want of a better phrase, must be less than $10 million. So an asset of $10 million or a business of $10 million that has less than $5 million turnover. And the company has to be a new company, or it must have been dormant since its creation. So dormant has a particular phrase, but effectively it means that it hasn't ever traded, hasn't taken on significant assets, effectively is a brand new company with, a nominal asset base being, some share capital, and, a small amount of it. So again, while it's a welcomed part of, I guess, the changes, it isn't the law, which is always concerning. We'd like to see it enacted into legislation rather than an administrative practice, because administrative practices can change at any time. But it is a step in the right direction, a small step, but a step in the right direction for Queenslanders. So that's the end of my presentation. We tried to, I guess, give you a good summary of two of the rollovers, particularly ones that we've used very recently, and I guess a look at some of those changes that have come into Queensland that might make some of these types of business restructures a little more palatable for Queensland taxpayers.
I don't actually have any questions for you at the moment, Paul. You must have either been very clear or you've bamboozled our audience, hopefully the former.
Probably the latter, but hopefully the former.
I have had a couple of people requesting those additional slides, which we will send to you privately. But if there are no questions for Paul, we can probably wrap up a little bit earlier and let everyone get off to their Friday lunch. But as I mentioned at the start, if you could please keep an eye out for our feedback email, and our next webinar will be on in a fortnight's time, and that will be looking at how effective it is to put your assets in your partner's name, whether that works as an asset protection strategy. So thank you again, everyone, for attending today's webinar, and we hope to see you in a fortnight's time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kate.